What do we mean square? Well, in the wood shop, square usually refers to 90 degrees. Here I've got a speed square, here I've got a combination square, and there's several other types of squares. But the square part of it refers to this 90-degree angle here. And when we call something square in the wood shop, we mean that it's perfectly 90 degrees. So let me just show you what we need to do here. When we're trying to square up this board, we need each of these faces to be perfectly flat, perfectly straight, and perfectly parallel. We then need to have both edges perfectly straight, perfectly flat, and perfectly parallel. And in addition, we also need them to be perfectly 90 degrees to the adjacent face. So when we put the square on, we need to have this be perfectly 90. This board has not been squared up yet, so it is a bad example of being square. But I'm going to use it to demonstrate how we square up a board. So now that we've got both faces perfectly straight, flat, and parallel, and we've got both edges perfectly straight, flat, and parallel, and 90 degrees, we need to get the ends to be perfectly straight, flat, and 90 degrees to an edge, just like so. We need them 90 degrees to the edge, and we need them 90 degrees to the face. So it's a very simple process that I'm going to guide you through, but we're going to make this board become perfectly square so that when we go and attach it to all the other parts in the project, that everything comes out perfectly straight, flat, parallel, 90 degrees, adjacent to the other faces, and all of your parts will fit perfectly together. Okay, that's what we refer to when we say something square in the shop, and that is why it's such a fundamental part of all woodworking. And that's what we're going to learn how to do right now. Start the process of squaring up this board. And what you need to know is it's imperative that when we square a board, we go in a very particular order. If you don't go in the proper order, your board will never come out perfectly square. So the very first tool that we're going to use is this jointer here. And when we use the jointer, we're going to pick one of the faces to joint. And the way you pick that face is you have to sight down the board down this angle here and see, does it curve off this way or does it curve off this way? And whichever way it's going to curve, if you think of it like a rainbow, we want the 2 feet of the rainbow to be down on the table. So mine has a very slight curve this way. Okay, I exaggerate it for the camera so you can see, but it's very slight. So I did a pencil mark all the way across this board here, just to mark it where it's going to be cut and where it hasn't been cut yet. So I put that pencil mark on the face that's going to be cut. I'm going to put that face down on the front of the jointer, and then we're going to slide it through the jointer. If you want to learn how to safely use the jointer, I have another video on how to safely use all the tools. But for right now, I'm just going to run you through jointing this face of the board, the very first step. Okay, so I'll turn the dust collector on and the jointer on. And when the board is perfectly flat, all of these pencil marks will disappear. And if you look on this board here, you can still see there's a little bit of pencil mark around here and some up here. So I know there's still some spots that are not perfectly flat. So I'll have to run this through the jointer one more time to make sure that, to explain to you why we are doing this and why the jointer works. It's very important for you to understand the rules, because every once in a while in woodworking you're going to have to break the rules. And if you don't understand why you're doing something, it's very hard to break those rules. So in this case, the jointer table is perfectly flat. It's got the infeed table and the outfeed table, and they're perfectly flat. The only difference between the two is that this one is slightly lower. It's actually 1/16 of an inch lower than both the blade and the outfeed table. So when you feed this board through, it's going to slide on this perfectly flat table. And no matter how the board is warped, it's just going to be fed right into that spinning blade. And the blade's going to cut a perfectly flat line across the length of the blade. And so as you push it through, it's going to cut a perfectly flat piece. And then, since the blade and this outfeed table are at the exact same height, it's going to cut a perfectly flat face on one of these boards. And so no matter how it's warped going into the blade is going to cut it perfectly straight. And it will shave all of that down until it's perfectly flat and smooth. Now, since this is a rather big cut and a hard job for a jointer, it's actually going to take several very tiny passes. It only cuts 1/16 of an inch off every time you put it through. So it may take 1, 2, 3, 4 passes to get it to perfectly flat, but eventually this tool will become perfectly flat on one face. And that's how the jointer works. We're going to use that perfectly flat face on the next step to make the other face perfectly flat. And we'll do that over at the planer. So the second step of squaring a board consists of doing the second face of it. So I already did one face on the jointer. Once I made a perfect joint on this face, I put a J on it to designate that it has been done already. Now what I'm going to do is put this perfectly flat face that I made on the jointer down onto the perfectly flat table of the planer. And the way the planer works is it's going to have a blade up here that is perfectly parallel to this perfectly flat table. So as I put that perfect face through that I did on the jointer, the planer will now come across and cut the top face perfectly flat and perfectly parallel to that bottom face. And that's how the squaring process works. It's going to use the previous tool's perfection to get the next side or face's perfection. So the way I set up the planer here is I'm going to lower this until I get a reading on the gauge here. And now my little needle is starting to move, so I know that's a good spot to start. So just like before, I'm going to draw these squiggle lines on it. And that's just going to cover the entire board and show me which areas have been cut and which areas have not been cut. And just like before, I'm going to keep putting it through until all of these lines disappear. And at that stage, I will have two perfectly finished faces. Now we have two faces perfectly flat, perfectly straight, and then also perfectly parallel. So we've got the perfect face that I jointed, I put a J on it. The perfect face that I planed, I put a P on it. So now I know both of those sides are completed and done. It's always a good idea to mark your work because sometimes you end up putting things down and you forget where you're at. So it's a good habit just to put a quick pencil mark on things you've done just to remind yourself at a future date. So now that we've got the two faces done, we always start our squaring with the two biggest sides, which is usually the faces, okay, the two biggest sides for our faces. The next step is going to be the edges, okay, and I always think of it like biggest to smallest. So faces are the biggest, edges are your next biggest sides, and then we'll finish with the ends after this. But to do an edge, we're going to come back to the jointer, and we're going to use a different part of the jointer to finish this. So our two faces are already perfect. Okay, so what we need to do is use this part of the jointer to make the next part perfectly 90 degrees. And we're going to be doing this edge here, and we want it to be perfectly 90 degrees. So this perfect 90 degrees here, we are now going to put this board with our perfect face up against the fence right here, and that will give us this perfect 90 degree cut on one of the edges. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and do that right now, and then that will deliver this 90 degrees to me. So I'll go ahead and do that right now. Just like before, you're going to figure out which edge of the board has the rainbow, and you want the feet to be down. So I sighted down my board, and it has a slight curve this direction. So I'm going to put this side down. I'm going to do the same as before, draw a little squiggle line all the way across the length of it. That way it'll tell me when I finished my job. Go ahead and turn this thing on. I'll check it, and in this particular case it got rid of everything in one pass, so I can go ahead and put a J on this one, and that will tell me that it is jointed. Now, a lot of people get confused and they want to turn the board over and do the other side. This, however, will not work, because while the edge will come out perfectly straight and flat, the edge will not be perfectly parallel. It will be angled one way or the other, flat and straight, but the angle of it will probably be different. So you can never edge joint both edges. We're going to use the table saw in the next step to do that. Okay, so you're only going to edge joint one edge. Very important detail to remember. One edge only on the jointer. Our fourth step of the operation brings us over to the table saw. And the way the table saw is set up is it has a perfectly flat table, it has a perfectly flat fence, and the fence is also perfectly 90 degrees. So from the table to the fence, perfect 90. Now we're going to use those features to make sure our board comes out perfectly square. So we've got our jointed face, we've got our planed face, and then we have one edge that's been jointed. So what I'm going to do is take this edge that's been jointed, and it doesn't matter which face I use because they're both perfect already. So that makes no difference. The only thing that's critical is that I keep the jointed edge up against the table saw fence. Okay? Since those are perfect, it will now allow me to make a perfectly parallel cut on the other side. So all I need to do is line this up so that I'm taking a tiny little bit off of the board. And usually about the thickness of the blade will work, but you could take less or you could take more if you need to. It doesn't matter. But we're going to shave off a little bit on the other side. And all we need to do is make sure that we shave wood all the way down the board. As long as we do that, we will have a perfectly straight edge. I'll grab my push stick over here, turn this thing on. And now the table saw has resulted in a perfectly parallel edge. So far we've done both faces and both edges. And I'm going to put a T for table saw in there just to show that I've done, just in case I have to come back to this at a later time. So now this face is perfectly 90 degrees to this edge here, and the two edges are parallel. So the last two sections that we need to work on are the two ends, and we'll do those in the next step. That we need to make to square up the ends. Most of you will accomplish this on a miter saw, and that's a very good way to do it. That's probably the most practical, common way that people are going to do it. But in my shop, I have one of these old-fashioned radial arm saws, and I like them just a little bit better. And I have mine set up so it's nice and convenient to use. So I'm going to use the radial arm saw today, but most of you will end up using the miter saw for this step. I just happen to like the radial arm saw because it is fun for me to use. It gives me very nice, accurate, precise results. So I tend to use the radial arm saw for this step. But again, the miter saw would be perfectly fine. Now, over at this saw, just like on the miter saw, we have a perfectly flat table and we have a fence on it. And the fence is perfectly 90 degrees. So we've done everything on this board except for the two ends. So perfectly flat on the table, perfectly flat up against the fence. And then the last thing that we need is this to cut us a perfectly 90-degree cut. So it doesn't matter which way we put this thing because everything else has been done. We just need to make sure that we're cutting off both ends. And since this tool is set up perfectly 90 degrees, we should get that cut just by shaving off a tiny little bit of wood. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and you'll see me shave both ends, and then we'll have a perfectly flat, perfectly... And there you have it. We now have a perfectly square board. Now, this video took, I don't know, 10 minutes or so, but once you've gotten good at this process, you can knock the whole process out in just a matter of a minute or two. It's a very quick, easy, efficient process. Once you've got it memorized, you'll fly through this. And this is the cornerstone of all of your woodshop projects. All of your square edges, all of your perfect pieces coming together, they're all going to come from a perfectly square board. So you've now mastered one of the fundamental principles of woodshop. Congratulations, and now get out there and make some sawdust.